Welcome to Shadow of Truth with your host Dave Kranzler and Rory Hall. And today is Monday, January the 25th, 2016. And we have the honor and pleasure of welcoming back Mr. Peter Schiff, who is the president of Euro Pacific Capital. And he also is very busy with lots and lots of videos. He's authored a couple of books, and you can catch his work just about all over the internet. Peter, how you doing today?
I'm doing good. How are you guys?
Doing all right over here.
Doing a lot better than they're doing in the Northeast. I mean, Denver's been in the 40s and 50s all week.
Yeah, well, at least they won the football game, though.
Oh, man. I couldn't get to sleep till about 2 in the morning last night. I was so excited about that.
Yeah, well, Belichick just didn't know. For some reason, didn't want to kick a field goal. I was really upset at the time. I was rooting for New England, and I didn't understand why they didn't kick that field goal when there was about 5 the first time. The second time, I understood why they went for it because they were getting low on time, but they should have kicked that field goal. They would have won that game.
Well, Peter, I understand you're down in Puerto Rico.
I'm here for like a week or so. So I missed the storm.
Well, that's good.
I missed the snowstorm. Yeah.
I think Dave's got a question pertaining to Puerto Rico. And Dave, you want to lead us off here?
Sure, that'd be great. So, Peter, you moved your business operations down to Puerto Rico, and obviously, I think everyone knows Puerto Rico seems to be collapsing under the weight of all of that muni debt it's issued. How do you see that playing out? And over what time frame? And the reason I want to ask this, I actually noticed, and I don't remember the details, it looks like there's a big chunk of debt that they're going to default on right away. Yep. And that was just in the news at the end of last week. And so over what time frame, and do you think there's going to be a contagion effect on the U.S. credit markets? And that's what interests me in this question, because I think there will be.
Yeah. Now, first of all, I moved just one business to Puerto Rico. I didn't move all of my businesses there. I had one company, Euro Pacific Asset Management, that used to be based in Newport Beach, California. That particular company and its employees are now here in Puerto Rico. I am also opening up a bank in Puerto Rico, a brand new. I have a bank in St. Vincent's and the Grenadines, and I'm opening a second bank in Puerto Rico. So I am doing some business in Puerto Rico, and the tax code and the tax breaks are a main reason that I'm down here. But by that token, I didn't loan any money to the Puerto Rican government. I mean, I wasn't dumb enough to buy any Puerto Rican bonds because they are in fact broke. People say, "Hey, why are you going to Puerto Rico? Look, they're broke." Look, you have to understand if you're going to be involved in Puerto Rico, what to avoid and what to take advantage of. And so the low taxes are good, but the government is in fact broke. And I think the tax incentives are part of the way that the island is going to rebuild its economy, but it's still struggling from years of socialism and big government, which ironically were made possible by the United States and by the Federal Reserve. If it wasn't for the Federal Reserve keeping interest rates so low, and if Puerto Rican debt wasn't exempted from tax in all 50 U.S. states, the Puerto Rican politicians couldn't have borrowed all this money in the first place. But once you gave them that possibility, of course, they acted like politicians and they gave away a bunch of free stuff because they were able to sell bonds to pay for it. And now those chickens are coming home to roost. But, Puerto Rico is actually a microcosm for the whole United States because we've done what Puerto Rico has done. In fact, ironically, the per capita debt to GDP is actually much higher on the mainland than it is in Puerto Rico. The only difference is the mainland has the Fed's printing press, and Puerto Rico doesn't. And so Puerto Rico is having to deal with its problems right now, whereas America is kicking the can down the road. But eventually, we're going to run into the can, just like Puerto Rico. They were kicking their can down the road for a while, too, and they finally caught up to it.
And speaking of the Fed, and as we all know, the Fed raised rates by 0.25% back on December 16th. And at that time, they said that they were going to have some more interest rate rises in 2016. And will the Fed, Peter, be able to raise rates again as they have planned? And will the markets be able to sustain another rate increase? I mean, as we've already seen the effects of this first rate increase. And where do we go from here with that?
Well, I do not believe the Fed is going to be able to raise rates again. That's the reason I thought they weren't going to raise rates at all. I figured they were just going to skip a rate hike last year because I thought they were smart enough to recognize what the consequences of raising rates would be, and they wouldn't want to put themselves in that box. And I guess I overestimated the competency of the Fed because they actually raised rates, apparently clueless as to the havoc that it would wreak in the markets. But I warned everybody what was going to happen. And of course, since they've raised rates, the month of January, this is the worst start to a year in the stock market in history. In fact, it's one of the worst months in history of any year. And of course, the U.S. economy is rapidly returning to recession. I think the recession has already begun. I think this greater recession that will be worse than the one we had in 08, 09 began at the end of last year. And I think it's going to gather momentum throughout this year. And I think that's going to make it impossible for the Fed to raise rates again. In fact, what I think is the most likely scenario is the Fed reduces rates back to zero and launches another round of quantitative easing before the election in November. The only thing I'm trying to figure out is what is the Fed going to blame it on? What is the excuse going to be that allows them to save face, yet still reduce interest rates and unleash QE4?
Or several people have said that QE4 is coming and that they were going to have to figure out a way, just like you were saying, figure out a way how to explain away the rate rise and then unleash QE4. What effect do you think that QE4 will have, Peter, if they do unleash that?
Well, it will be very destructive to the U.S. economy, as was QE 1, 2, and 3. I mean, the reason that we're not really out of the woods, the reason that we haven't had a real recovery is because the Fed didn't let us have a real recession. I mean, as bad as 08, 09 was, it would have been worse had the Fed done the right thing and not pumped up the markets and the economy with more cheap money, which was the cause of the financial crisis in the first place. But instead of recognizing their own culpability in that disaster, they just repeated all the mistakes that they made that caused it. And so now we're just going to have a worse decline. But what I don't think is going to happen is I don't think it's going to be as good for the stock market as it was before, because the recession is already underway. That's not going to be stopped by QE. And corporate earnings are already falling. That's not going to change by QE. And the admission that the economy is so weak that it needs QE is going to destroy the narrative that the U.S. economy is in such great shape, and it's no longer going to be the safe haven for capital around the world. So I don't think it's going to help our markets very much. It may stop our markets from falling, but what it is going to do is prick the bubble in the dollar. The dollar has been the biggest beneficiary of the false confidence in the Fed and the U.S. economy. And when that's shattered by the fact that the Fed has to do QE4 and has to lower rates, people are going to connect the dots and realize that we've never recovered from anything. The economy is sicker than ever, and the Fed is going to make it even sicker with more of this toxic monetary policy. And the dollar's going to tank, and the price of gold is going to skyrocket. And people need to prepare for that now, because once these moves start to happen, once people realize, what should be already obvious, but once they figure it out, there's not going to be any time to act. People need to prepare for that right now.
Couldn't agree more. Dave?
Yeah, Peter, I agree with everything you said. I think a lot of people, including myself, would argue that they keep kicking the can down the road because it enables Wall Street to continue making a lot of money off of their monetary policies. But I think that this would probably be a good place, especially since you mentioned the pricking of the dollar, to kind of lead into the next question that I had. Including myself, a lot of people believe that QE, ZIRP, NIRP, etc. must lead to hyperinflation, and at least for the time being, it seems to have simply created a massive deflationary wave. Why do you think that is? And, do you think we're ultimately, especially if they do another round of QE, is that going to lead to hyperinflation?
Well, hyperinflation is the worst case scenario if the QE never stops. And if the government eventually recognizes that quantitative easing is the source of the problem, not the cure to the problem, then we can avoid hyperinflation. But I think we're going to have a very elevated level of inflation, even if we don't have an extreme version of hyperinflation. But you have to look at the dynamics. Where has the money gone? The money has gone into assets. It's gone into the stock markets. It's gone
Yep.
into the bond markets. It's gone into rare art or collectible automobiles. I mean, it's got, so real estate prices have benefited from all this monetary inflation. So you have seen the impacts, but also consumer prices are rising. Rents are rising. They've been rising rather rapidly for years. Healthcare costs are rising. Educational costs are rising. Insurance costs are rising. Utilities are rising. The cost of food is going up. There's all sorts of costs that are in fact rising. And, given some of the underlying weakness in the economy, a lot of those prices would have been falling, but for all the money printing of the central bank. So the fact that consumers were robbed of the benefit of lower prices is still inflation, because goods that would have been less expensive now remain the same in price or only went up a little bit. But they were denied the benefit of a reduction in those costs, which would have been beneficial. But ultimately, I think that the willingness of people to park their paper in financial assets like bonds is simply a function of their lack of understanding or appreciation of the problems that exist and their false confidence in central banks. But once they realize that they bought into a bill of goods and that the economy is not recovering, that it's relapsed back into recession, that QE is never ending, this confidence is going to be shattered. And people are going to rush to cash in their claims to wealth for real stuff. And all the money is going to move. All the inflation is going to migrate from financial prices to actual goods prices. And then you're going to see the big increases in prices. But of course, by then it's too late for the central banks to do anything about it, right? That genie is way out of the bottle. You can't put her back in. And what the Federal Reserve is going to have to do to prevent hyperinflation, they're going to have to slam on the brakes, Volcker style, maybe even more so. And can you imagine the havoc that would reach in the over-leveraged U.S. economy to have 10 or 20% interest rates, given how levered up everybody is? Corporations, homeowners, the U.S. government. I mean, if you thought 2008 was bad, what we're about to go through is going to make that look like a Sunday school picnic. And if the Federal Reserve doesn't have the guts to do the right thing, then we will have hyperinflation, and that'll be even worse.
You touched on a point there, Peter, that I wanted to bring up, and that's the retail market. And you mentioned food going up. Food is going up, and anybody that doesn't understand that obviously doesn't go to the grocery store. And a couple of weeks ago, you had did a podcast where you were talking about the bricks and mortars versus online, and the retail stores are collapsing on all fronts. I mean, online commerce is not picking up the slack of the brick and mortar retail collapse. And how will the Census Bureau be able to continue propping up the employment numbers with everything, literally everything, in free fall? I mean, how are they going to be able to do that?
Yeah, the employment numbers are really the biggest sham out there. We're hiding behind, this, it's like a veil of where this unemployment number of 5% and all these so-called jobs are draped over what is really an awful economy. But, nobody can see it because they're looking superficially at these numbers. But what the numbers don't tell is the real story of the American labor market, which is a complete disaster. Number one, labor force participation has imploded in a way that we've never seen. I mean, these trends have been in place for a while, but they really accelerated during this downturn, where people have left the labor market in droves by the millions. People are no longer working. Young, able-bodied men in particular have no jobs, right? They're not even looking for jobs. And so one of the reasons that the unemployment rate is so low is because people who aren't working aren't looking. And if you're not looking, then you're not considered unemployed. But also, millions and millions of additional Americans have settled for part-time jobs. And so even if you have, a master's degree and, you're an unemployed engineer, but you're working part-time at McDonald's, that part-time McDonald's job counts as being employed. And even if you're still looking for a better job when you're not cooking French fries, that doesn't mean you're unemployed either, as long as you have something. And here's the biggest irony. If you have three part-time jobs, if you work three part-time jobs, and the total of those three part-time jobs is equals at least 35 hours a week, right? the government considers all three of those part-time jobs to be full-time jobs, even though none of them are full-time jobs. So the other story here is this is a part-time economy, and nobody is looking at the nature of those jobs or the pay of those jobs. So yes, the reason that we're creating all these jobs is because we're counting all the part-time jobs as full-time jobs. And in fact, so many employers are eliminating their full-time jobs because they cannot afford the full-time benefits, especially when you take into account Obamacare. That what happens is, let's say you're a business and you lay off your full-time workers, and now you replace them with a part-time workforce. Because each person is working fewer hours, you need to hire more part-time workers than you used to have full-time workers. So if you're one of these full-time workers who got fired, and now you have two part-time jobs that together don't even pay what you used to earn in the one full-time job, the Obama administration takes credit for one new job, even though you've destroyed a full-time job and created two part-time jobs. It still counts as two full-time jobs replacing the full-time jobs that was lost. So these numbers are a sham. The labor market is a disaster. And as bad as these jobs are, we're going to lose a lot of these jobs in this next recession. I think a lot of these part-time jobs are going to go away between now and the election, which is obviously going to be instrumental in the way people vote, because you're going to have a lot more people voting that don't have jobs. And of course, when you don't have a job, you have more time to vote because you don't have to show up at work.
Exactly.
This is that's great stuff. And I didn't want to spend too much time on this, but I think it's worth flushing this out because you mentioned the labor force participation rate and what's enabled the government to keep the illusion that the economy is still going and going quote unquote well is these entitlement programs like Social Security Disability and the Student Loan Funding Program. Now, I read and I can't remember if what I read suggested that Social Security Disability gets tapped out at the end of this year or sometime during 2017, but that fund is going to get tapped out. And a lot of people who are on Social Security Disability, we know that a lot of it is a sham. They gave sham reasons. Oh, I get headaches and I can't work. Okay, you get Social Security Disability. Well, those people then become part of the pool of people who are not considered part of the labor force. So, and then the other thing is students. I mean, it's been real convenient for the Obama program to enable the proliferation of student loans. I mean, you can get student loans now for massage school, because it also allows them to take people out of the labor force, which obviously helps the unemployment rate. I mean, at some point, those programs are going to run into a wall. How are they going to keep this thing going?
Yeah, and one of the other reasons they want to keep the kids in school is because while they're in school, they don't have to count them as delinquent in their student loans because they're not required to repay them. So they want to get them in graduate school, so they could constantly stay out of the labor force and not have to repay loans that they're never going to be able to repay. Look, and a lot of people, too, live on their student loans. There are a lot of people that are only in college because they want the loans. That's the only way to get access to the credit. They don't even care about the education. They just have to sign up for some college so they can borrow money to pay their rent. That's what's going on. And the debt is going through the roof on student loans, as it is on auto loans, which is another bubble that the government has inflated with their cheap money. This is just one gigantic bubble economy. And you mentioned the disability. We have seen an explosion. You go back and look over the last several years at the enormous increase in disability claims. Now, I ask you, is it possible that all of a sudden a bunch of Americans became disabled? I mean, why? What the actual disability is they can't find a job. And so they're lying. They're pretending to have a disability so they can collect on the disability program. I mean, that obviously, statistically, there's nothing wrong with the country that we all would suddenly come down with all these disabilities. But the fact is, people can't find jobs. And so now they're pretending they're disabled, which helps the government because they don't have to. Now they can pretend that these people aren't really unemployed when they are. The only disability they have is they can't find a job.
Which is a crime.
Right.
I mean, these guys is.
Yeah, and it's actually the economy that's disabled. It's not the workers. But look,
Exactly.
yes, Are they committing a crime when they submit a fraudulent disability claim? Of course they are. But I mean, welfare fraud is rampant. I mean, everybody knows this. I mean, food stamps. I mean, we got what, 50 million people on food stamps? I mean, are all of them really, of course. I mean, that's the reason you don't want government to have these programs, is because they're going to be rife with fraud and abuse. I mean, that's how government works.
And it's unfortunate, and the people that are left working are the ones that have to foot the bill.
Yeah, and then of course more and more people who are still foolish enough to work become incentivized not to, because they look at all the people who aren't working and maybe are living better than they are because they have a lot more leisure. That's the most valuable thing. What most Americans value most is free time, leisure. And of course, if you're not working, you got plenty of that.
You got all you want. I actually worked with a guy in retail he was on part-time, and he told me that he was going to quit because he made more money, a lot more money, being unemployed than he did being employed. So he
of course quit. But even if you do make a little bit more money having a job, is it actually worth the aggravation?
Right.
And because most people don't enjoy their job, right? If you ask the typical guy who has a job, do you look forward to quitting time, or are you upset, when you get to leave, right? I mean, are you excited when you wake up in the morning and you have to go to work? Or would you rather just stay in bed, right? Most people don't want their job. A lot of guys have 2 or 3 jobs, right? They don't want any of them. You got a lot of retired people. Next time you go to Walmart or something and there's a 75-year-old guy greeting you, you think he wants to be there? Or do you think he wants to be playing golf? Or do you think he wants to be, on the beach somewhere? He wants to be enjoying his retirement. So there's a lot of value to not working. The fact that you don't have to fight traffic and get up early and shave and do all this stuff and put up with a boss you don't like and coworkers you don't like. I mean, most people hate their jobs. So you would almost pay to get rid of the job if you can. Now, there are some people who like what they're doing, and that's great. But most people don't. And so even if they can earn a little bit more working, if they can get by with not working, they will. See, the government makes it too easy. See, what should be the case is, hey, if you don't have a job, you have no place to live. If you don't have a job, you're not going to eat. Okay, well, I guess I'm going to have to get a job. But the government basically says, look, you can still eat. You can still have a place to live. You don't have to work. Just sign up for welfare. We got you back. So a lot of people take them up on that deal.
Exactly. Dave, you got anything else?
No, this has been great.
It's been really good.
We really appreciate your time. We hate to spoil your tranquility down there.
Okay,
you look so relaxed.
It's a rainy day here today, so I'm indoors anyway. But look, just definitely what I said earlier to anybody listening to this show, do something about what you're hearing. I mean, I think there's a great opportunity. Yes. Gold's now back above 1,100, but it's still extremely cheap. I got a gold company, Schiff Gold. If you don't own any physical gold, you should buy some. We got some of the lowest prices on the internet. We don't rip people off with numismatics at schiffgold.com. And for people that have bigger portfolios, if you're invested in the stock market, you got an IRA, you're in the market or you're in the bond market, you really need to get out of the U.S. You need to look at places like Singapore, like Switzerland, like New Zealand. You got to invest in the right markets. You got to get out of the U.S. dollar. This is a great time to do it because the dollar bubble is, at its peak. Everybody is so convinced that, the Fed saved us and cured us. They don't realize that they now gave us a lethal dose of this disease. And so before, somebody figures it out, that's higher up, you got to do something. And my brokerage firm, Euro Pacific Capital, Europac.com, EUROPAC.com. Check out our website, talk to our brokers, see if there's something that we can do to help diversify your portfolio, get invested outside the United States to protect you from the dollar crisis that I think we are headed right for.
Yes. Real quickly, Peter, are you starting to see a big increase in the people who are buying precious metals from you?
Not really. I mean, I think business has picked up a little bit this year over last year, but still it's, business is about half of what it was. And it's not just me, it's everybody that's in this industry. Sure. About half of what it was back in 2010, 2011. And of course, back then prices were much higher, right? We were selling a lot more silver at $40 an ounce than we are at 14. a lot more people were trying to buy gold at 1,800 than trying to buy it at 1,100. But of course, obviously, it's a much better time to buy now because the prices are lower. Of course, the people that were buying back then didn't expect them to be this much lower, but here we are. But I think the people that bought gold at 1,800 are going to make a lot of money on that gold. I just think that people buying gold now are just going to make even more. In most cases, they're the same people. I've got clients who bought gold from me a few years ago, and they're buying more gold now. I mean, some of these clients bought gold from me when it was at 300 and 400, right? So, as long as you're constantly buying gold, I mean, sometimes you'll buy it a little higher, but eventually the dollar is going to collapse, and the people who are going to be hurt the most are the people who never bought any gold, and that's most people. They're going to be broke. They're just going to have a pile of worthless paper.
If you don't mind, Peter, I'd like to ask you one more question.
Yeah.
And what do you see as the reasoning for Russia and China not stepping up and calling out the Federal Reserve and the U.S. Treasury for the fraud that they are? I mean, why would they not do that?
Yeah, especially when one of the biggest problems that China's having right now is this strong dollar undermining confidence in their currency and their ability to maintain their peg. And the same thing with Russia. What's really hurting Russia is the weakness in the ruble. And you would think these countries would maybe want to take a shot at the U.S. to try to alleviate that pain by casting some doubt on the invincibility of the dollar. And the only thing I can think of is maybe secretly, before they do that, they want to buy up as much cheap gold as they can. And as long as they can maintain artificial faith in the dollar, they can suppress the price of gold. And both the Chinese and the Russians are big buyers of gold. And if I'm right and they want to buy a lot more, they want to keep the price as low as possible until they're finished. And once they've got all the gold they can get their hands on, then they'll let the hammer down on the dollar. And then all that gold that they bought will be a lot more valuable.
And then China can step up and start making the rules, because he who has the gold makes the rules.
Right. And the factories, and that's what they've got.
Exactly.
They've got all the production. They're going to have all the real money. And yes, but that's why, you got to position yourself, do what the Chinese are doing, because they've got all the resources. And if they're buying gold, you better buy it too.
Exactly. Well, like I said, we've been speaking with Mr. Peter Schiff, and you can find all his work, just like he was saying, over at europac.com. You can find his blog there, and you can find it at the Daily Coin, which we repost probably 95% of his work over there.
Yeah, I do my podcast is the Peter Schiff Show, which I do at schiffradio.com, just schiffradio.com, and also my YouTube channel, The Schiff Report. You can, listen to all the stuff I put out.
Which you are a very busy man. And and with that, we're not going to take up any more of your time, Peter, and we look forward to speaking with you in the near future.
Okay, thanks a lot, guys.
Thank you.
Thanks, Peter.